Let me just find the number 2 here. Yes. Up to 42 books read this year. I am here to talk about all of the books that I read in April. I did not read 42 books in April. I read 7. Hello and welcome to my channel, In Search of Wonder. My name is Anne, and here I talk about the books that I read and the things that make me wonder. I also talk a lot about coffee. I'm experimenting with layered coffee drinks, and I'm starting to get the hang of it, but I'm not sure about the strawberries. Anyway, April reading. It was a decent month. I didn't get a lot of reading in, so that's one thing. 7 books, which is a little bit on the low side for me, but some of them were really good books that I thoroughly enjoyed the reading of, or I really loved the books. So I'm just going to walk through the books that I read in the order that I read them to begin with, and then after that I will talk about the different challenges and the books that met those challenges, and overall how I felt about my reading in April. So to begin with, I finished up A Woman of No Importance, which was actually had been begun in March. Sorry, that was terrible English grammar, but we're not going to fix it. We're just going to keep moving forward. A Woman of No Importance. It was nonfiction, so biography, about one of the first members of the French resistance in France, although she was an American woman who was working for the British. And the British were trying to stir up the French resistance in the fight against Germany. And she was one of the first people there, one of the last to leave in terms of the World War II and the French involvement, etc. And she was one of the most effective at what she did, and one of the best, because although she, how do you say, she got made a couple times, she was never actually caught, and as I remember correctly, and she saved a lot of people's lives, and she accomplished a lot of missions. She collected and shared a lot of information and intelligence with the British armies, and so very successful. It was fascinating to read. She did all of this with a bum leg. When she was a young woman, she had a shooting accident, shot one of her legs herself, and so it ended up being amputated, and she had to have a prosthetic leg for the rest of her life. So she did all of this with her wooden leg. Crazy. Very impressive woman, very impressive career, very impressive life that she had, and so I really enjoyed reading that biography. I gave it 4 stars. I also read Green Glass House, which again was a holdover a little bit from March. I had started it in March, towards the end of March, and I ended up finishing it, I think, in very early April, like one of the first days of April. And overall, I enjoyed it. It was not my favorite. It was middle grade to start with, so that's always, not my favorite genre, to be perfectly honest. But also, there were some aspects of the story that I didn't think were particularly well done. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great. And I enjoyed this setting, and I enjoyed, to an extent, the fantastical elements of the story were kind of cool. There is a twist in the storyline that I won't spoil, but that was fun. But there was just some extra characters that didn't need to be there. There was a very little explanation or reason given for some of the things that happened in the story that really needed some explanation. Otherwise, why were they there? Or they were either extra or they needed more explanation. And I just felt like it could have been a lot tighter of a narrative and a lot more impactful of a story if it had been tightened down a little bit. And then I read 12 Years a Slave, which was a slave narrative by Solomon Northup, who actually was a free man living in, oh goodness, New York, I want to say. But he was tricked and kidnapped and sold into slavery illegally. And he spent 12 years as a slave in Louisiana. And this is a detail of the horrors that he experienced there, and also his emotional journey, which I think in the end probably did him in. The trauma that he experienced of going from being a free man to being a slave, and then when he was freed again, the story ends there pretty much. His narrative ends there, but it was sad to realize that after a couple of years, he disappeared from public life, and there are only rumors and speculation about what happened to him after that. And I have to think that PTSD played a part in that. So that was a very sad narrative, but it was a very important one, and the story was gripping. I couldn't read a lot in one sitting because it was just too heartbreaking, but all the same, it was gripping, and I couldn't read anything else either. So I read that book in little bits of time as much as I could, but that was the only thing I could read at the time until I finished it. Was able to pick up something else. And then I read, so I gave that one 5 stars, by the way. And then I read Seeking Persephone, which was a read along and watch along that Taylor Tales and Treats with Tay was hosting. And it was so much fun. Sarah M. Eden, I always mix her up with Sarah E. Ladd. Pretty sure Sarah M. Eden is the author of Seeking Persephone. And it is a Regency era retelling of Hades and Persephone. And it was really fun. I love how she worked out the elements of that story in a modern, not a modern day, but, you know, compared to Greek mythology. And I like how she brought it to life with real people and real setting and realistic elements. There were a couple of things that I felt were not as well done as the others, primarily the wolves, which were supposed to represent the hellhounds. I think it was a good idea. I'm not sure that it was fully realized in a way that really made sense with the story and the way that it played out, but it was all in all an interesting book. I really liked our main character Persephone, and the male main character Adam was not intended to be likable because he was like the Hades kind of guy, right? But he grows on you in the course of the story, and you come to realize that there's more to him than the exterior gruffness that you see. And I feel like, so we watched the adaptation of it. I was only able to see the second half, but I did feel like the movie did a great job of helping you see the goodness that was in him underneath his really gruff and rough and honestly frequently rude or even mean exterior. His persona that he put on underneath was a much more genuine, kind, and caring person. And I think the adaptation helps you see that. And so I did enjoy that one overall and gave it 4 stars. I think it rises above the rest of your run-of-the-mill Regency romance novels. I think it even rises above some of the author's other books. And it was a worthwhile one to make into an adaptation for sure. And then I also read A Brilliant Night of Stars and Ice, which is a novel, and so it's fiction, but it is telling the true story of the USS, I believe. Well, anyways, it's a ship. No, actually, I don't think it was, I think it was an HMS, Carpathia, which was the ship that came to the rescue of the Titanic. Now, they were too late, honestly. By the time they got there, because they were that far away, they came as fast as they could, literally as fast as they could. But by the time they got there, the Titanic had completely sunk, and the few people who had managed to be rescued in the lifeboats were, floating around in the water in their little lifeboats. And so the Carpathia picked them all up and then brought them back to safety. and to New York. And so it tells that story of that. And it was really neat to see that side of the Titanic story, which is one I did not know about at all. And I really appreciated the author telling us that story and sharing that with us. We get the perspective of a passenger on the Titanic and the captain of the Carpathia. And it was really wonderful to see how the crew and the passengers of the Carpathia worked together. People of all ranks and classes working together to save and assist the survivors of the Titanic. And also, I think that the trauma of experience of the sinking and everything was very well written. It wasn't too much. It wasn't too dramatic or too traumatic, but it was enough to give you a sense of what it would have been like, to imagine what it would have been like to be there. Yeah, and you get a glimpse into some real life characters that were on the Carpathia. And overall, it was really well done. It wasn't a perfect one. I felt like sometimes, particularly the perspective from the captain, I felt like could have used a little bit improvement, but all in all, very enjoyable. And I do recommend, if you are interested at all in the Titanic or maritime disasters, or you just like historical fiction based in true stories, I think that you would enjoy that one. And also, I don't normally like seafaring stories, but I did enjoy that one. Then I read These Healing Hills, written by Anne Gaphardt. And that one is set in the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky. And we have a young woman who goes to a midwifery school there in Kentucky, which is a real school. Again, we have a historic setting with some real, genuine historic characters. All the main characters are fictional, but there are some real life historic characters. It's set in the post-World War II era, like immediately following World War II. And we have a soldier who's just returned from being in the war. And we have our female main character who is suffering a broken relationship, kind of tangentially also related to the war. So they're both dealing with fallout from the war, and they're both trying to find out, where is home for them. And they both, as the title suggests, have some healing that needs to happen because of the things that they've experienced recently in their lives. And so it's their journey of healing. And it is a romance, but it's so much more than that. It's about the setting. It's about the aftermath of World War II and the healing that happened from it. It's about life in the mountains in that time period in Kentucky. And it's about this nursing school and the midwives who were trained there. There's a lot to it beyond just a mere historical romance. It is actually really beautifully told, and I really enjoyed it. I only give it 4 stars though, because I loved the characters, loved the characters, loved the setting, loved the story. I enjoyed everything about it, but it ended very abruptly, and it did not tie up all of the loose threads. I don't understand why authors introduce threads in a story if they're not going to finish them. Like, okay, you started this line of thought. Where are we going with it? And it's not a series. It's a standalone book. That's my only complaint. I felt like there was a lot of loose ends at the end that didn't get tied up. I need a Jane Austen pretty bow tied up at the end of the book, okay? I need to know what's happening with everybody, where everybody's going, and all of the resolution of all of the conflicts and questions introduced in the story. That's what I need. Didn't get it in this one, but otherwise I really enjoyed it. Finally, I read The Rose and the Thistle by Laura France, and that one is set in Scotland during the time period of the Jacobite Rebellion, which was a fun and somewhat unusual setting. A lot of Laura France's books are set in America or England in like the colonial era, but this one takes a step back to the Jacobite Rebellion era, and there's Catholic versus Protestant, and the Stuarts versus the Hanovers. And it was very interesting the way that she developed those themes, but also we're primarily focused on our main characters, one who is Catholic, one who is Protestant, and just the journey that they take. Again, I gave it 4 stars because, again, I felt like in a different way to These Healing Hills, I feel like there were some things that weren't necessarily fully resolved. In particular, I feel like some elements of the story were too easily resolved. Like, it was kind of convenient the way things happened, not just at the end, but sort of throughout the story. There were some really just convenient things. And to me, that's a little bit of lazy storytelling. It wasn't terrible. It didn't ruin it for me, but it did take a little bit away from overall my appreciation of the book. But I loved the characters, and I love how the story played out all in all, by and large. And it kept me reading. After a certain point, maybe the first 30 to 50% of it was a little bit slower. But then as it got going, it was very gripping, and I didn't want to read anything else until I finished it. So those are the 7 books that I read in, what month am I talking about? April. I read those in April. And that brings my total for the year to 42, like I said. So even though I didn't read as much in April, I had read a lot in other months already this year. So I'm still ahead of my goals, if I have them, for the year. And this is what my book tracker looks like so far for 2026. And these pink ones here are April. And I've got one for May already, but these are the April ones, which is a little tiny stack compared to the ones that were going on earlier this year. Oh, but that's okay. I am happy to say that in April, I was able to add another book to my 10 at a time, which brings my total to 4. So I'll link to my 10 at a time video where I explain that if you don't know what I'm talking about. But I have 10 books at a time that I am wanting to work through in 2026. I would love to get through 10 all together. If I can get through 10, then I'll start this again at some point this year. But right now, I'm just on track because I've read 4 with A Woman of No Importance. But that means I need to add one. So I have 10 books in my, in an envelope in my reading journal in here. So I have 10 books in here, and these are the ones that I'm picking from when either if I'm mood reading and I'm like, okay, what am I going to read next? Or if I'm making my TBR and I'm trying to find books that fit with certain themes or ideas or whatever, I pick from here because those are priority books that I want to finish. So I only have 9 in here now because I read one and I haven't replaced it yet. So right now, guys, this is so exciting. I am going to pick one to put in there. And maybe it might even make it onto my May TBR. Oh, okay. This is Live Your Truth by Elisa Childers. So this is a Christian nonfiction, and I do want to read that one. My sister gave that to me for my birthday last year, I think. Or for Christmas. So I do need to read that one sooner rather than later. So that is going to go in my envelope and become one of the ones that I can pick from going forward. I also was able to add a 5-star book. So these are my 5 stars that I've read this year so far. Not too shabby. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in 4 months. And 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup is the most recent one. And 12 Years a Slave is the book that I applied to my Reading the Classics challenge. The prompt was of the people, by the people, for the people, read a memoir or biography. And so 12 Years a Slave was a memoir. Also, A Woman of No Importance was a biography, but it wasn't a classic. And also it went for a March prompt for a different challenge. Journey Through Time, the Historical Fiction 2026 Reading Challenge. For April, the prompt was At Sea, and that is why I read A Brilliant Night of Stars and Ice. And I had been wanting to read that since I heard people talk about it last year. And so I added it mentally to my TBR for this April, even as of last year. And so I'm so glad that Alma made that a prompt for April, because it gave me, it reminded me that I had wanted to read that book this April. And then for Jeanette's Christian Fiction Bingo, April, the prompt was a healthcare worker and a favorite genre. My favorite genre is historical fiction, and These Healing Hills was all about a nurse midwife and a medic in the army. So that covered both of those prompts, These Healing Hills by Anne Gaphardt. So I'm up to date on these challenges. And then Chantal's challenge, April, the title should include a conjunction. And so I had a few actually that could work for that. But the one that I put was The Rose and the Thistle by Laura France because of the word and. From my shelf, I'm trying to read 50% of the books that I read from my shelf. So I'm doing okay, but I'm a little behind because I've read 42 books, and so far I have 19 on here. I should have 21. So I'm a couple behind as far as reading from my shelf. I had done great with this last year. This year I'm lagging a little bit because April, a few of the books were either on Kindle or actually like A Brilliant Night of Stars and Ice and These Healing Hills and Seeking Persephone were all on Hoopla or Kindle. And so those were all digital ones that I did not have in my physical TBR collection, and I didn't even own them before I read them. So yeah, I need to focus more on that. I think in May, I'll bring that up a little bit again. So, and then I keep track of my 2026 nonfiction reads. The goal is to read at least 12, but ideally more than that. So I should have at least 4 to be on track for this year. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Twice as many. That's awesome. I don't know that I've ever done that well. And 12 Years a Slave was the one that I added in April. So I did participate in a couple of different challenges. One was the Spring into Classics by Sarah Collar. Now this goes April through May. And so I had already made my TBR by the time I decided to join in on this challenge. And so I only fit one in, which I didn't even finish in April. But since this readathon goes into May, that's fine. I read The Enchanted April at the very end of April, and I finished it at the very beginning of May, so that counts for that. But also, my husband and I started watching The Count of Monte Cristo for the classic adaptation, so we started that also in April, and hopefully we'll have time to finish it in May. We'll see. I don't know. We haven't had time to watch. We watched 2 episodes, and I don't remember how many there are. Yeah. I also participated in the Read Happy Readathon, and I will put the hosts in the description box. There's quite a few wonderful ladies, their names are all here, who put on this readathon, and it was a lot of fun. I got most of the prompts. I only got 2 bingos though. One down this way, Cozy Setting, Kindred Spirit, Pet Companion, and one this way, Kindred Spirit, Free Space, and Community. I missed out on Delicious Food and Favorite Hobby because none of the books, even if I were to double them up, none of them, I don't know, really worked for that. But for the cozy setting, I counted the Green Glass House because that is a very cozy setting. It's all set in a house during a snowstorm, and it has all the cozy feels. It's set at Christmas time, perfect for coziness. For the happy ending, I read Seeking Persephone, which is a romance. Of course, there's a happily ever after there. For Community, I said A Brilliant Night of Stars because of the way that the crew and the passengers of the Carpathia came together as a community to help the Titanic survivors. For Pet Companion, I included These Healing Hills by Anne Gaphardt because the male main character, he gifts the female main character with a dog, and that dog actually plays a key part in the story from the point that he gives it to her, and it becomes a character in the story and plays a key part in the plot. So that was Pet Companion. And then for Beautiful Scenery, I put The Rose and the Thistle because it's set in Scotland. What more do I need to say? For Kindred Spirit, I put The Enchanted April. Again, I finished it in May, but I counted it anyway. And that was for the ladies who find the kindred spirits with each other, which surprises them. They didn't expect, I don't think, to have such kindred spirits with each other, but they do. And then for the Free Space, I put in 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. Finally, I also participated in People April, and 2 of my books qualified for that. One was the Woman of No Importance, and the other was 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup, and those were fantastic reads to go with that readathon, which is to read about real people, basically. And if you want to throw in there A Brilliant Night of Stars and Ice, that was about a real person, the captain of the Carpathia, and it was about a real historic event. However, it was fictionalized. So even though I think almost everything that happened in the story was true and factual, it was still fictionalized. And so I don't know that it necessarily fits, but it was about a real person, and I did find it very interesting. So that was my reading in April. It was pretty good, even though I didn't have as much in terms of quantity, and the quality wasn't exceptional, but It was very good, and I'm glad I read everything that I read in April. Very worthwhile, and it was decent. It was decent. Doesn't rank top tier as a month of reading, but it was decent. So let me know in the comments how your April went in reading or in real life, and if you can find a little boat emoji, put a little boat emoji there for our Titanic and Carpathia story that I read in April. So let me know in the comments your thoughts about your reading or my reading, and let's keep chatting, and I will see you next time.